Let's talk about the evolution of flight in bats. Next week we will talk about the diversity of bats. The first point that I want to make is this question about whether flight in bats evolved from the ground up or the top down. The bird people argue that the evolution of flight is from the top down. Mammal people tend to bird people tend to argue that the evolution of flight is from the bottom up, and mammal people argue that it's from the top down. Why is that? The bird people like the idea that birds evolved from dinosaurs, and we talked in class about the difficulties, the neuromuscular control difficulties, and the energetic difficulties, the physics problems with taking to the air from the ground. For bats, we know that the group of mammals leading up to the bats are these small arboreal insectivorous types of mammals which were easily able to get up into trees. And it's a pretty easy transition to go from the top down. So to go from an arboreal form to a gliding form and then to true powered flight. So that's the hypothesis that we prefer. Remember with the bottom-up hypothesis, as soon as your toes leave the ground, you're no longer accelerating, so you are decelerating. And if you're going after insects, which is presumably what the earliest birds did, then they would have lost velocity and the insect would have gotten away. Why would it not have been possible for birds to evolve from the top down? Well, if they are evolved from dinosaurs, we know that the dinosaurs did not get into trees, so they were not arboreal. The next point to be made is that in the evolution of bats, the transition from an arboreal insectivore to the total bat form must have been very quick. Here on the left, you see a fossil of a bat, Icarus, and this is clearly a very good bat. There are some differences. You note that the scapula are different, and there are differences with fusion of the radius and the ulna, and then the sternum is different. But otherwise, it's a very rapid transition. Why is that? That's pretty straightforward. Half a bat can't fly. So if you have just partial wings or emergent wings, wings that are not yet fully formed in the evolution of a bat form, that clearly would provide no selective advantage. Recall that in lecture we talked about Sewell Wright's adaptive landscape, and we talked about Fisher's fundamental theorem, that is that fitness can only improve. So if you are an arboreal insectivore and you develop half a wing, that half a wing is not going to improve your fitness. So that transition from a fully functional arboreal insectivore to a fully functional bat must have been extraordinarily rapid. And if that's the case, then the chances of finding a fossil form is highly unlikely. We talked at some length about the morphological differences between bats and other arboreal insectivorous mammals. Those include differences with respect to the musculature, more detail on that later, forearm specializations, modifications of the shoulder, and then hind limb rotation. And of course, what's going on with echolocation. The muscular differences are associated primarily with the flight engine and how you get extension of the wing, so that when the arm is held out, the wings automatically, the fingers are automatically going to spread out. So there is not energy involved in the animal attempting to do that. Next, on modern bats, the radius and the ulna are fused to form one solid structure. And of course, those limbs are long and lightweight. So just as birds strive to have lightweight appendages, the same thing is true for bats. There's modification of the shoulder. That is, there are these, what we refer to as stays, these little projections that prevent hyperextension of the limbs, so that the wing, both at the forearm and at the shoulder, are going to lock into place. So you can't overextend that wing. And then with the back legs, the hind limbs, the hind feet are rotated 180 degrees. And that's advantageous, particularly for those bats that are fishing bats that use their rear feet to capture fish right under the surface. And also for those bats that are using their back legs to spread the uropatagium and catch insects on the wing. And then, of course, there are all the morphological adaptations associated with echolocation. So the tragus and the nose leaf and those sorts of structures. We talked at some length about what it means or what's required in order to fly. There are a few things we need. The first is some kind of a lifting surface. And in each group of gliding or flying vertebrate, there is some kind of a wing. In the case of bats, that wing has camber. We talked about camber and the Bernoulli principle, and also the fact that the wing can also be used to generate propulsion or thrust. The other important thing to remember is that the camber and of the wing and the angle of attack are going to determine the amount of lift that's generated. They will also determine the amount of drag that's generated. And we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. Just a little bit about the aerodynamics of bat flight. Remember, too, that in birds, there are two power strokes. So both the upstroke and the downstroke of the wing beat cycle generate both lift and thrust. In bats, that's not true. It's just the downstroke. Remember, too, that birds have this clever little trick that they do with the pectoralis muscles so that the muscles that are bringing the wings up are the pectoralis muscles, and the muscles that are bringing the wing down are also the pectoralis muscles. That's not true in bats. In terms of general morphology of the overall body, remember that especially on animals that have small Reynolds numbers, that is, very lightweight animals, it's best if the body mass is concentrated near the center of mass. So the wings and the periphery of the animal is very lightweight. All of the mass is concentrated at the center. The same is true for inexpensive airplanes. So if you buy a Piper Cub or something of that sort, it's going to be a plane that is suspended, a cabin that's suspended below the wing. The Piper Cubs had cloth wings and cloth bodies, all that designed to reduce mass. So bats are doing essentially the same thing. The other thing, of course, that's going to be essential are the physiological and central nervous system changes that'll be necessary to manage flight. Recall the basic morphology of the bat. Notice on this bat, Townsend's big-eared bat, notice how large the ears are. Inside each ear is the tragus. So both the tragus and the large ears are designed to pick up the echolocation echoes as they're coming back. Notice the fingers. The very first finger that you see projecting out is the thumb. So on this particular animal, you can see, let's see if I can get the cursor over there. There's the thumb, right? So what that means is the elbow is right there. So there's the forearm, there's the elbow, and right here's the hand, okay? So there's the first finger, second finger, third, fourth, and fifth finger. This is all the patagium. Notice there is a patagium right here as well, right, between the shoulder and the wrist. And then notice too that there is a patagium here between the hind feet. So all of these structures are lifting surfaces. If you look at this carefully, you'll see all of these little cartilaginous elements going through the wing. This is muscular right here, and this trailing edge is muscular as well, and those can be used to control the camber of the wing. We talked about the physics of flight. Notice the diagram on the right-hand side of the slide. So there are a couple of things that we're interested in. The first is the camber of the wing. Notice that as the air flows over the wing, the air going above on top of the wing actually has to cover a greater distance than the air going on the bottom of the wing. So therefore it's going faster. That results in negative pressure on top of the wing, and that's what's generating the lift. The angle of attack, that's the angle between the horizontal and the wing. You can see that in the middle. That angle of attack is essentially going to increase the amount of lift that you get, but it is also going to increase the amount of drag. If you get too much drag, right, and the amount of drag exceeds the amount of lift, then of course there's going to be stall. So then, for high camber wings, you get high lift at low speeds, but excessive drag at high speeds, and that's because both the profile drag and the parasitic drag. And what that implies then is that compared to other sorts of flying planes or whatever, or birds even for that matter, for the most part, bats are going to have relatively lower speeds but higher maneuverability because of the amount of lift that they're able to generate. So the camber and the angle of attack are going to be held constant during the wing beat cycle, and they're both going to be controlled by the propatagium and the plagiopatagium. The propatagium is that bit of skin which stretches from the shoulder to the wrist. So that's the very first part of the wing. The plagiopatagium is the wing that's stretched between all of the fingers. And then, of course, it can also be controlled by the position of the humerus and the radius, plus the occipital-pollicalis muscle, which is controlling the leading edge of that, especially of that plagiopatagium. And here in this diagram, you can see these muscle strands, which are going in two directions throughout the wing. And those muscle strands then are what's being used to control the shape of the wing, so the camber of the wing. And there also you can see this occipital-pollicalis muscle, which is on the leading edge of that plagiopatagium. So the trailing edge, the tension at the trailing edge is going to be controlled by the hind foot, and also then by the tensor plagiopatagii muscle. The camber is going to be via the humerus and digit number 5, and those can be modified both for extreme lift, especially at low speeds. Thrust is going to happen during the wing beat cycle, and that's going to be because of the trailing edge of the chiropatagium, while the leading edge is rigid. So you can get a modification at the trailing edge and then hold the leading edge rigid. In terms of the shapes of the wings, we need to think about what the aspect ratio is, and that's going to be the length divided by width. That's generally how we as biologists do it. More appropriately, it's going to be the square of the wingspan divided by wing area. So you can easily see that the size of the wing relative to the size of the body is going to be one of the key factors that determines what the wing loading is. So an animal with really large wings and a relatively small body mass is going to have low wing loading, and an animal that is very heavy and has small wings is going to have high wing loading. That's going to be especially important during when the females are carrying young, right? Because then suddenly their mass increases and the whole physics of flight is going to be somewhat different. So low aspect ratio wings are good for low speed and high maneuverability. High aspect ratio wings are going to be good for rapid flight and endurance. So here are some examples. On the upper left, you see an animal that has a low aspect ratio wing. Bottom right is an animal that has a high aspect ratio wing. So the animal upper left, that would be like a crop duster, a plane that would fly very slowly but has extreme maneuverability. Bottom right, that's an animal like Tadorida that is going to be capable of more rapid flight, more efficient flight, and being able to cover much greater distances. Tadorida does fly very long distances, especially in the fall and spring, so that makes sense. We talked about echolocation. True echolocation occurs only in the Microchiroptera, not in the Megachiroptera, so not in the giant fruit bats, but it does occur in all of the other bats. More about that business next week. The sound is produced in the larynx, and it's emitted either through the nose or through the open mouth. We also talked about the amount of energy involved in those calls, noting that it's about 200 dynes. And one of the things that the bats do to prevent themselves from going deaf from the high energy of their own screams is that they have this special little tensor muscle which tightens up the tympanic membrane. So for a fraction of a second before they emit the sound, they tense that muscle, and while they're emitting the sound, the tympanic membrane is mobilized, and they aren't going to make themselves go deaf. Remember, 200 dynes is about the amount of sound energy that's coming out of the exhaust on a top fuel dragster. So you're going to go deaf if you're listening to that all day long, and they clearly are not. It would not be good if they were to do that too. We talked very briefly about high intensity pulses or hip bats and low intensity pulses. And those are oftentimes referred to as the whispering bats. There are some foraging differences between those types of bats. More importantly, we talked about why bats are using high frequency sound waves rather than other sorts of sounds. Well, high frequency sound waves have short wavelengths. Those high frequency sound waves attenuate rapidly in air. So whereas whales are communicating at extreme low frequencies, so below the threshold at which you can hear sound, their sound waves travel thousands of miles through the water. These guys in bats, their sound waves are traveling relatively short distances. So it's unlikely that they're traveling much farther than 50 meters, but it's relatively short distance. So the high frequencies are associated with shorter wavelengths, and what that means if you're going after small objects like moths or mosquitoes or something of that sort, those short wavelengths are going to return to you much more information than if you were to use a longer wavelength. One other important point about the use of high frequency sound waves, and that is that enables you to avoid all the background clutter. So most of the sound that is out there in the acoustic landscape is going to be within the audible range. Using ultrasonics, you are more distinct from that background noise. We talked about two different sorts of echolocation signals. We talked about FM signals and CF signals. FM signals are frequency modulated. In general, they're relatively short calls, and then they sweep across a relatively wide band of frequencies. So FM signals are ideally suited for determining size, shape, surface qualities, and the range of a particular target. CF signals, on the other hand, are constant frequencies, so they last a little bit longer, but they usually stay at one constant frequency until the very end of the call, at which times they will oftentimes sweep across a few wavelengths, but not to the same extent that an FM bat does. So CF signals are good for detecting presence, and by using Doppler shift, they can determine whether the prey is approaching or departing. Doppler shift, if you ever stand on a street and a motorcycle goes by, you notice that change in frequency as the motorcycle goes past you. That's Doppler shift. We use the same principle to figure out that the universe is expanding rather than contracting. So here then are some sonograms of 4 different species of bats. Eptesicus in the top, and you can see that its vocalization is sweeping across a large frequency range, so all the way down to 20 kilohertz, from 100 kilohertz all the way down to 20 kilohertz. If you're an 18-year-old boy or a 17-and-a-half-year-old boy, you can hear all the way up to 20 kilohertz. By the time you're 18, you can no longer hear that. Females are not able to hear up to 20 kilohertz. Why that is, who knows? So 20 kilohertz is the extreme upper limit of what you are able to hear. Anything above that is considered ultrasonic. So Aptesicus is going all the way up to 140 kilohertz. There are some bats which go significantly higher than that. So looking at these calls, you can see that Aptesicus and Pteranotus are clearly FM bats. Rhinolophus, the third one from the top, you can see there that initially it has this nice constant frequency with the trailing edge of the call just sweeping across a short frequency range. And then Tadert at the bottom, you see that at the beginning, as it's approaching, it looks as though it is a CF bat. It's a relatively short signal, and it seems to be at a very narrow band of frequencies. But then as it's approaching its food item, the rate of those pulses increases and it begins sweeping across a broader frequency range. So Tadert too is an FM bat. All right, that's it for today. Next time we'll be working on Chiropteran diversity.